In Chapter 13, we explore the psychology of working theory. So we're building on all of the previous theories because we're getting pretty close to recent developments here. And prior to Bluestein's work, there were a lot of underlying assumptions that earlier theories have made, and we've talked about these before, but it's worth noting them again. So first, there was this underlying assumption that everyone has just equal opportunities and abilities to make choices about their work. So there's this underlying assumption in a lot of the previous theories, particularly the first evolution of theories around like Holland and around trait and factor and around the idea of theory of work adjustment, that everyone has choices when it comes to work. And that doesn't necessarily accurately represent the picture. Often work comes down to a combination of factors, and not everyone has the same opportunities and privileges to make choices about where they work and make those choices solely based on things like interests. So there are a lot of restrictions, and we'll dig into this more in the chapter, but things like geography. If you live in a community and the only locally available careers are in some sort of factory or in a mine or in some sort of plant that is locally located, then you may not have a lot of choices because maybe your choices are to work in a grocery store or to work in a factory. And those really aren't necessarily the choices you would make if you had other things available to you. Similarly, thinking about, for example, military spouses and dependents. They are often moving around, and so your choices related to work are very much restricted to what's available to you at your base or in the community very near to your base. College students have a lot of limitations when it comes to work. So there are a lot of underlying assumptions in previous theories about work being a choice, and work being a choice that everyone gets to make solely based on things like interest and like thinking about work adjustment. If my work is not working, my work environment is not conducive for me, then I can change it. And that's not necessarily an accurate depiction of everyone's picture. Second is that work is a contained part of people's lives, meaning that there was this underlying assumption that work is just sort of like this thing that you go do during the day, you collect your paycheck, and then you come home and you do your actual life. And as we've talked about through the evolution to more recent theories, and then talking in the last chapter about civicus and the more recent work related to career lifestyles, career is really part of identity. I mean, it's really embedded in a large portion of our time, a large portion of our life, a large portion of our identity, and our measure of success in the world, especially in the Western world. We very much tie this idea of meaningfulness and satisfaction in life to satisfaction and success in career. And so prior to that, when we talk about, oh, let's just match things up based on interests, it sort of oversimplifies the picture. It doesn't necessarily represent how much the idea of work and career is really tied to identity in a lot of ways societally. Third, there's a lot of assumptions about the world of work being predictable. So I can make plans and predict that, like, if I choose this job, this career field, it will remain here for me as long as I want to keep it. And I will consistently be employed as long as I am able to meet the qualifications and the needs of my job. So as long as there's that satisfaction and satisfactoriness, right, then we should be good to go. And again, that doesn't necessarily accurately represent the picture. I mean, think about just in the last 5 or 6 years, how much the world of career and work has shifted and changed, and how much types of jobs and careers that were maybe listed on some of the original versions of the strong interest inventory just don't exist anymore. I mean, thinking about like industries that have shifted, changed, and have become obsolete because of new developments, and conversely, all of the new industries, all of the new career fields that have been developed that just didn't exist at the time. And so we see that. We see a lot of shifting towards, people getting laid off, people changing jobs more frequently, people having to seek out new skills or figure out ways to change parts of themselves to fit into industries they've been in for a very long time, but now the industry's changed and they have to keep up. So there's an assumption in the earlier career theories that work and the world of work is one that is very stable and predictable. And time has really shown us that that is not the case at all, that things are shifting and changing all the time. And so our understanding of career and our approach to career has to be really adaptable and malleable to those changes, or else we're not really connected to the people we're serving. The fourth assumption is that an individual will make a decision about their career earlier in their life, and they're done. That's it. You make a career one time, or you make a decision about career one time in your life, and then you work in that career until you're ready to retire, and then you retire, and then you're like happy and playing golf and like going to the beach and like whatever retired people do. So there was this assumption that like you make this decision once, you make it like when you're in high school or maybe when you get back from military service, and then you're done. You're set. It wasn't really until we got to like Super and Gottfredson that there was any conversation about how to make a shift in career at different points in your life space. In fact, some of the earlier theories, if you revisit them now that we're talking about it in a more modern context, they almost project a sense of shame and deficiency on the individual if at the midpoint of their life they're needing to make a career shift. It's like, oh, well, maybe you didn't make the right decision when you did this the first time. Let's try to make sure you make the right decision now. So, huge paradigm shift to our current understanding of like career, just like identity, is very fluid and it moves and it changes throughout the lifespan. And I think we're seeing in more modern industry that happening even more because the individual is that we see this sort of like shift away from career being central in life to everything else is central in life. And career is just sort of this thing that I do to provide for my life. And maybe it's meaningful. That's great if it is. But maybe it's not. And maybe that's okay. And it's left the industry in a bit of a confused space because the industries and the career spaces are used to being the center of everyone's world. And all of a sudden they're not. I'll change a job if it's conducive to my life and it meets my needs. And I'm not worried about the job or the industry anymore. And I'll make decisions to set boundaries to step up my career life, my work life balance, to honor my needs, my family, my like other hobbies, interests, etc. And I'll push back against career and work wanting to be the center of the world. So think about like, it's kind of a weird metaphor, but think about like you have a teenager who's used to being the center of attention. And then all of a sudden you're like, go sit in the corner and only come over here when I call you. That teenager's not going to like it very much. But earlier career theories really assumed that you're going to make a decision early in your life and you're going to stick with it, and that's going to be the center of your world, and that's going to be it. And we're in a totally different space now than when those theories were developed. And then the fifth one is that career counseling is really this like short-term process that's really focused on this idea of providing information and supporting decision making. So when someone seeks out career counseling, it's going to be like 2, maybe 3 sessions if it's a complicated situation and they need more resources. You're going to give some sort of assessment. You're going to determine their interests. You're going to help match them up to careers and maybe do some coaching around like interviewing, resumes, like psychoeducational or support pieces that connect them with career. And shifting to these more modern views of things, remembering our conversation about Civicus's work and his model, and then looking at David Bluestein and his theory, they really talk about the integration of career into life. And so counseling is a holistic practice, and career is a part of it. But we should see all of these things connecting together. And so what career counseling ends up looking like is, in the midst of my overall counseling process, career comes up and we do some processing around it. And maybe an individual wants some information about new career options. I certainly give strong interest inventories in my outpatient mental health practice. And we talk about options, because if we're discussing the impact of career and someone's like, well, I think I do want to make a change, but I don't really know what's out there. Okay, great. There are some wonderful tools that we can use to explore and talk a bit about those options. But I'm not going to pressure them to make a choice. I might provide information, but we take that choice away. And so these 5 underlying assumptions really guided and provided a foundation for those earlier theories. And now as we shift to this third pillar of career, and we're talking about this like new paradigm of career counseling, we're going to blow them up. We are going to take these underlying assumptions and say they are not accurate, and we're going to paint a new picture of the way things work. So I want to just give a little bit of perspective here. So these are sort of the big 5 or 6 theories that guide our work. And so looking at these, I just want to give the context of the timing of when these things were developed as compared to these 2 last theories that we were discussing. So when we go all the way back to trait and factor theory, that's like 1909 that was developed. That was a long time ago, and there was a very simplified view of career, and there were a lot less options. And as we remember, a lot of the development of what we understand now to be career theory came from military service members needing to find ways to adjust back into civilian life after service and duty. And so we saw a lot of like, okay, what are your skill sets? What can you do? Here's something to do. It made sense. So we had trait and factor back in 1909. We saw career development theory that came out. We saw this big boom of development of career counseling work in the 50s and 60s. This also conveniently was when the American Counseling Association was founded, because it used to be a collection of different organizations, including career development and personnel and guidance association. So they came together to create what would be the ACA right around this time period as well. So really our profession as a whole grew from and was founded on the idea of career counseling. So just bearing that in mind, it's a big part of who we are professionally too. So we saw career development theory in Super's work, considering the lifespan in 57. Holland in 59 developed that REASEC model with theory of career choice. We saw a shift in the 60s talking about work adjustment with Doss and Lofquist. And then we jump again to see this change in the 80s and 90s with our friend Godfredson with circumscription and compromise, and then going into SCCT in 94. So we're spanning about 90 years here. A lot happened, especially in the history of the United States in those 90 years. And then now we're flashing forward to looking at Civicus's work and Bluestein's work, and they were like 2005, 2006. So then we're jumping again another 10 years to our new sense of understanding about the world and career and work. So let's talk about Bluestein. So David Bluestein developed Psychology of Working in 2006. Civicus was in 2005, so they were right around the same time. Honestly, I'm unsure if they really knew each other. Bluestein was out of, I believe, Boston. Um, and so I don't know that I'm sure he and Savickas met at some point because all the career folks often connect, but I don't know that they worked together. They just sort of developed theories around the same time. So David Bluestein, 2006, developed Psychology of Working, and his mission and goal in this was to take into account systemic factors. He really wanted to address those underlying assumptions and say, you know what, it's not a level playing field. It's not the same for everybody. There are a lot of contextual factors that impact the way career plays out for individuals, and a lot of things change. So we need a theory that's going to account for that. And it's really interesting when we get to looking at his model, comparing trait and factor with the complexity of the psychology of working, and just the difference between, you have this personality trait, this career has this sort of like similar thing, here's your match, to the complexity of the model that we're about to look at. It's pretty incredible to take a look at what we've done in 110 years or 100 years. So Bluestein really was about this idea that in order for humans to be fulfilled and find meaning in a sense of working career, they need three things. They need survival, so they need economic factors to be provided so that they can survive. They need to be connected and related to individual, not like literally familially related, but like have meaningful connections in a social sense to a community of some sort. And they need some sense of self-determination, meaning they need to have some sense of autonomy and drive and ability to make decisions. So here's the model. And you thought Savickas was complicated. This one's even more complicated. It looks that way, but it's really not. And as we walk through it, I think you'll find that it makes a lot of sense. So Bluestein was about this idea that career is an activity. It's not the entirety of the person. So he and his contemporaries like Richardson really wanted to decentralize the idea of career in a person's life. It's something you do. It can be a means to an end. That's okay. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It's okay if your career is not your entire life. In fact, it might be a good thing. And so in his model, he really talks about two things. He talks about predictors, which you see on the left side, and then outcomes, which you see on the right. And so let's break these things down. So predictors are, predictors of the outcome of your career, right? So these things are interconnected. And he accounts for the different things that would go into predicting a career outcome and a career decision. So in terms of predictors, we start with the numbered lines. So we'll start with 1 all the way on the left-hand side. And the lines really, there's two different kinds of lines. And the reason that they're different is because there's a difference between things that Bluestein developed theoretically, but don't necessarily explicitly have empirical research to support. I think there's a lot of historical context to support them as a theory, but there's not explicit published research. And then, well, as connected to this career theory, I think there's published research about the concepts in general, but not for this specific theory that he developed for career. So let me clarify that. So the dotted lines are ones that are only theoretically supported by previous understanding. And then the solid lines are things that have supporting empirical research, documenting that these are real things that impact career. So let's start with the number 1 over there. There's this idea that there's economic constraints, meaning that not all neighborhoods have the same opportunities, not all individuals have the same opportunities. There's a lot of things that factor into your ability to get certain types of jobs, careers, and keep them. And so also, as part of that, people need money to live. And so sometimes you have to make decisions based on your economic needs. If you need money now, maybe you can't wait for the right career to come along because you got to take what you can get. or, regionally, geographically, take what you can get, right? Then there's this idea of marginalization, which is this social justice perspective that for some individuals, there are more barriers that exist between them and their goals because of systemic practices that they don't necessarily have any direct connection to. They didn't do anything to create. They just exist in a context where they are, and they get in the way sometimes. So that's one. And then those things are obviously connected. So the more marginalized someone is, the more economic constraints there are. And then economic constraints feed marginalization, and it's a vicious cycle that goes over and over and over again, often by design. So those things are interconnected. Then we have these two concepts. There's work volition, which is this idea that you have to make choices about what you're going to do based on the economic constraints and the marginalization that you're facing. And so work volition can change based on how many choices you feel like you have. As economic constraints maybe become less, you have more opportunities, or we're able to address systemic barriers and address marginalization. You might have more volition because you perceive yourself to have more choices, as opposed to when those things are more of a factor in your life. Same with career adaptability. So do you have the readiness and resources to cope with making decisions and with challenges related to career? So we're dipping a little bit into the old school, like satisfactoriness, theory of work adjustment piece. So like, how prepared is an individual to adapt accordingly in the world of work and to the challenges that come up? And then all of these things come together into this idea of seeking what's called decent work. And decent work is really just this idea of work-life balance, first of all, and being able to go to work in an environment that's safe, where you have like food, water, adequate breaks, you're compensated adequately. There's like OSHA regulations are followed, and then you're able to go home and attend to your family, and you're paid a livable wage, and you have access to healthcare. So like, you have all the things that you need to be able to thrive as an individual, right? Which we talk about a whole lot when it comes to justice issues in career. So all of those factors become predictors in a career outcome, right? So outcomes are about this idea that we are trying to get our needs met, right? So we have basic survival needs. We need food, water, shelter. We need safety. We need social connections. And we need the sense of self-determination. So the Bluestein is connected with the self-determination theory, which is really big in the positive psychology world. And self-determination theory talks about this underlying concept that individuals are always striving to be doing things that feel really authentic and meaningful to them. So self-determination needs would be my need to have something meaningful come out of my work. I'm not just punching a clock to pay the bills. There's something that's meaningful and impactful in the work that I'm doing, in the way that I'm spending my time. And so according to that self-determination concept, the more sense of self-determination, meaning, and authenticity you have in your work, the better you're going to do at the tasks related to that work, which makes sense, right? Like, when we're connected to something and invested in it, we put in more effort. When we're not, maybe we don't put in as much effort. And so there's outcomes related to the decisions that you make, because you have needs and you're going to make decisions to get those needs met. And you sometimes prioritize those three needs based on what your current situation is. So you're going to prioritize survival needs if those are not being met. If they are being met, maybe you can focus more on social connection or self-determination, but those become a little bit of a luxury depending on the predictors we're working with. And then, if all goes according to plan, we have varying levels of the sense of fulfillment and well-being that comes out of our career. So based on predictors, we may not have as much fulfillment and well-being. We may not get those needs met because of things like economic constraints and marginalizations and lack of ability to find decent work. So this looks super complicated, but it makes a lot of sense. And then when we talk about moderators, like we're low level talking about statistics here also, like in an unscary way. Predictors, outcomes, and moderators, we're talking about like structural equation modeling and regression modeling. Like we're talking about correlative relationships here. So with moderators, those are like drivers of social justice that can make change in the predictors, right? So having a proactive personality, meaning that you are passionate about addressing systemic change. Critical consciousness, meaning you're aware of systemic issues that are preventing and creating barriers for others. Having adequate social support, and having access to economic support. And so we have like economic constraints and then economic conditions, right? So if we improve the conditions, there aren't as many constraints. They connect. So there are these external factors that play a role in the availability of decent work as the economy, like systemically on a broader, more like macro exo level. As the economy shifts, we have more decent work opportunities available. As the economy shifts, then we may not, right? So it really depends on factors outside of the individual that moderate how those predictors play out. Here's the really neat part of this whole theory is that by acknowledging how complex this whole picture is related to career, we have this idea that economic success is not as simple as choosing the right job and working hard enough. There's this integration of this idea that there's a lot of contextual factors and a lot of things that play into economic success or struggle and success in career or not. And so this theory really calls for us to have something called critical consciousness, which is this idea that social inequity and social structures and policy decisions and those kinds of things shape oppression. And those don't happen equally to all persons. So there's this idea that based on your intersecting identities, some of those may be deemed as socially less acceptable than others. And there might be systemic structures in place that then create inequity and greater disposition towards economic hardship than they are for others. This theory was one of the first to really talk about things not being a level playing field, and the idea that identity outside career can have some impact on your potential for economic success was groundbreaking at the time. It was a really big shift. So as career specialists, as counselors, there's this call for us to become agents of action, and this idea that we need to reflect critically on systemic reasons for injustice and marginalization and the true cause of economic constraints. And so we can't oversimplify this picture with our clients by ignoring those factors playing out in their career space as part of their life, and the hardships and psychological impacts of career spaces and the challenges that arise based on identities and societal structures that are in the way. And so we have to be proactive in that we also are getting involved in the process. We're becoming advocates. We're both with our clients thinking about things dynamically and thinking about potential resources or solutions that can be offered to address inequity as it arises, but also on a broader scale, we're addressing this systemically too. And social support is really important in the career space. Like up until more recent theories, career is really talked about in isolation. This theory really talks about the idea that we might need social support. We might have those coworkers that we really depend on. We might need some processing space to deal with things that have come up in the workplace. And that really creates a more dynamic option as a career specialist or as a counselor to be able to look at things holistically. We're in that postmodern era where careers are integrated into the life space and into the therapy space really holistically. And so we can challenge these systemic structures. We can provide support for the impacts of the structures. And we can look at things dynamically in a way that maybe we didn't when we think all the way back to things like trait and factor. So in a postmodern space, we're way more dynamic, way more holistic, and thinking about careers not the center of a person's universe, but definitely a factor that impacts their wellness and their life spaces and the trajectory of their life.